Thousands of people are expected to take part in a protest march in London today, ahead of next week's G20 summit, when world leaders meet to discuss the world economic crisis.
Well, the rally marks the start of a challenging week for police in the capital. They say they're facing unprecedented levels of planning between campaign groups.
Yes, Jane Haddon is at Victoria Embankment for us this morning, where the march is due to start a little later on. Jane, a lot has been said in the run-up, well, particularly to do with the events later in the week, but what are you hearing about today's march?
Well, Charlie, we know that the police have got contingency plans in place to deal with as many as 40,000 protesters converging here on the Victoria Embankment later today and marching through central London. We are told that today will be a peaceful protest, and it will probably serve as a pretty useful exercise for police in preparing for things later this week, which we think as it gets closer to the summit, things could heat up a little bit more. No matter what's going on though in London, Gordon Brown is going to be determined that that doesn't overshadow or affect things that go on behind the closed doors of the summit, because on the agenda there, number one is absolutely to come up with a plan with the other world leaders on how to rescue the world's economy, and secondly, a matter very close to Gordon Brown's heart, is to agree a way of unifying an approach to regulate the banks to make sure that when this recession finally lifts, that there is no other economic collapse, that will never happen again.
Jane, for the moment, thank you very much for that. And I know this is what I'm going to pick up on a second, front page of The Guardian here, talking about the police tactics, question marks over what they've been saying in advance of the protest later this week and also that event today. Yeah. Where are you going to start us, Kevin?
Start with The Guardian and the protests, G20, and questioning whether the police tactics are right, and are they talking up the possibility of violence. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is the complaint of David Howarth, a Liberal Democrat spokesman, because today's march put people first. It's going to be led by a Salvation Army brass band. It's trade unions, churches, groups, charities. I'd be very surprised if anything went wrong on that march. Now, later in the week, as the Guardian details inside, it could get hotter, because the groups are... You go basically from peaceful demonstrators to those who will use non-violent action, to those who will smash buildings up, to those who will think it's fair game to attack people. And they've been plotting in detail, as the Guardian says. And some groups were meeting in an old vault of a bank and taking the SIM cards out of their mobile phones so they can't be tracked by the police.
Now, some of the papers are suggesting that one of the police tactics has been to sort of actively contact these groups and, if you like, warn them that we're ready for you. I mean, you can look at that two ways, can't you? On the one hand, you can say that's good police work, yeah, and that they're putting out the warning signs, so there's no doubt. On the other hand, the suggestion seems to be that you're upping the ante. That's
right. I think there's one unnamed senior commander quoted on the front of The Guardian saying the police are up for it, which sounds provocative. In truth, the police kind of lose both ways here. If they talk it up in advance and everyone's out in riot gear, they get accused of being provocative. If they're not prepared for violence and it erupts and the City of London is smashed and people are beaten up, well, they get blamed for that. Yeah. So, I mean, in a way, I accept the police are between a rock and a hard place.
Thousands of people are expected to take part in a protest march in London today, ahead of next week's G20 summit, when world leaders meet to discuss the world economic crisis.
Yes, the rally marks the start of a challenging week for police in the capital, who say they're facing unprecedented levels of planning between campaign groups. Jane Haddon is at Victoria Embankment for us this morning. Jane, that is where the march is due to start a little bit later on, isn't it?
Yes, that's right, Susanna, and police are expecting up to 40,000 people to converge here at the embankment around about 11 o'clock this morning and onwards from then. The reality is we really don't know exactly how many people are going to turn up to march through central London. But as you say, what we do know for certain is that the police are going to face a pretty difficult time this week ahead of Thursday's summit, where the leaders of the richest and most powerful nations of the world are getting together to try to come up with a plan to heal the world's economy.
The authorities are determined to prevent a repeat of these scenes in Seattle 10 years ago, when anti-capitalist protesters went on the rampage during a World Trade meeting. Police in London say campaign groups not seen since then are once again planning demonstrations ahead of this Thursday's summit of world leaders.
People are protesting today about fundamentally the same thing that they were protesting about 10 years ago, which is that the entire economic system is unsustainable.
Those protests begin today with 150 organisations, including the TUC, marching to Hyde Park for a rally. It's thought the recession and rising unemployment could encourage as many as 40,000 people to take part.
They're going to be angry about the fact that they didn't cause the crisis, but they're paying for it. There's lots of money to bail out the banks, and that's the right answer, but there also has to be money to provide jobs and social security.
Today's protests are expected to be peaceful. There's much greater concern about Wednesday, when anti-capitalist campaigners will gather in the financial heart of London. 3,000 extra police officers have been drafted in at a cost of more than £7 million to try to stop the next few days' protests descending into violence.
Well, no matter how violent those protests become, Gordon Brown will be absolutely determined that when the summit meets on Thursday further down the river here, that their minds will be focused on one thing only, and that is how to come up with a rescue plan for the global economy. Second on his mind, and very close to Gordon Brown's heart, is to get an agreement on a unified approach on how to regulate the banks to make sure that when this recession lifts, that a similar slump in the economy can never happen again. Back to you.
Jane, thank you very much.
The security in London is unprecedented. Police keep vigil across the city as protesters converge. Businesses are boarded up, people are staying away from work, and there's a widespread anticipation of violence. Early morning in the City of London, police are on the highest alert as they, politicians and protesters, gather for a testing day. Humphrey Hawksley, BBC News.
I want to go to the city now. Our special correspondent, our colleague Ben Bryan, is there for us. Ben?
Yes, well, it's all quiet here at the moment. It's quite a nice day, very dry and bright. And in a way, for the police, I suppose that's the worst weather. They were perhaps hoping that if it was cold and wet, that would deter protesters from coming here. But this is where the protesters are going to be coming for what they call their Financial Fool's Day. There have been some provocative leaflets going around from the G20 coalition group of protesters who are going to be coming here saying hang the bankers and storm the banks. So certainly the police are prepared for the worst. Let's just take a look around. At the moment, actually more journalists than protesters. But over there, just behind, you can see some of the windows around the Bank of England boarded up. Certainly businesses, shops, cafes and so on, many of them fearing the worst and fearing that there could be violence too. And the police operation that's going to start today and continue tomorrow is one of the biggest London has ever seen, if not the biggest. Thousands of officers, all police leave cancelled, and a total cost of something like £7.5 million. It could rise way above that. Well, what's going to be happening here in the next hour, just 50 minutes from now, 4 processions from 4 nearby underground stations will start. The protesters are calling these the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Those 4 processions will converge here at the centre of their protest at midday, just outside the Bank of England. There'll be other protests in other parts of London too today, including anti-war protesters. They'll be gathering at outside the US Embassy at Grosvenor Square. Let's talk to Andy Tye now. He's at Gold Command, the headquarters of what is, as I say, a mammoth and very complicated police operation. Andy.
Yes, Ben, this is very much the nerve centre of that operation. The screens that you can perhaps see behind me give the police access to some 3,000 CCTV cameras all across the capital. And I'm joined now by one of the senior officers in charge of all of this, Commander Simon O'Brien. Commander O'Brien, first of all, tell us about the arrests that have been made in the last 24 hours.